Okay, hello everyone. Ramadan Kareem. I'm Naseel Moursy, and I will be taking you through the endocrine and ovarian cycle. So usually, everyone loves the menstrual cycle, estrogen, progesterone, and all that stuff. But people kind of tend to shy away from the ovarian cycle because the follicles might be a bit complicated. But trust me, they're not. They're actually cute. Okay, and hopefully this lecture helps you guys. So first, we're going to be going through an overview of the menstrual cycle and ovarian phases. You will be getting a separate session about the menstrual cycle, but we're just going to go over it generally here. And then we'll talk about the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, then the ovarian hormones, folliculogenesis, ovulation, and the corpus luteum. And finally, we'll have a few practice questions. Okay. All right. So first here, menstrual cycle again. Now, if you understood this figure, you basically understood the menstrual and ovarian cycles. Okay, so we'll start off with the estrogen and progesterone. We have them here. Okay, these are the hormones that are secreted by the ovaries, the two main hormones. Okay, we do have others that we'll be talking about later. Now, down here, we see the wall, the endometrial wall, and how it's progressing throughout the menstrual cycle. And up here we see the ovarian cycle itself, what happens to the follicles, and above that we see the pituitary hormones. So FSH is the one in pink and LH is blue. All right. Remember, this is day 1 on this side, and this line in the middle is the day of ovulation, day 14, and here towards the other side is day 28. Okay, so let's start off. Now, first of all, we know that estrogen and progesterone have this negative feedback mechanism on the anterior pituitary. Okay, so basically, the more estrogen and progesterone you have, the more you inhibit the secretion of FSH and LH. Okay, however, towards the end of the menstrual cycle, these hormones go down, and we'll be explaining why later on. Okay, but because they go down, so you remove that feedback inhibition on the anterior pituitary. So what happens to FSH and LH? They start getting secreted. So go up here to the pituitary hormones and you see FSH going up. Okay? Now, FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, meaning that it will stimulate some follicles to start maturing. And so that's why we start getting follicles developing here. Okay? However, why is it that FSH goes down later on? Well, as the follicles develop, they start secreting estrogen and progesterone, but mainly estrogen in this phase. Okay. Remember we said estrogen has a feedback inhibition on the pituitary. So because we're getting follicles that are growing, you're getting more estrogen being secreted, and so this inhibits the secretion of FSH from the anterior pituitary, and that's why FSH goes down. So this explains the peak of FSH we see. All right. Then even though, okay, FSH is decreasing, but the follicles are still being stimulated to grow until you finally reach one dominant follicle, okay? And that would be your mature follicle. This mature follicle secretes so much estrogen to the point that estrogen now isn't negatively like giving a negative feedback to the pituitary. It switches to a positive feedback mechanism, meaning it stimulates anterior pituitary. So what will it do? It will stimulate the LH surge. Now, when we get the LH surge, remember, equals ovulation. So you get the ovulation, you get the egg going out of the follicle, okay? Now, as the egg goes out of the follicle, you're left with the remnants of the follicle itself, and this develops into the corpus luteum, okay? Now, the corpus luteum itself, instead of secreting high amounts of estrogen, it switches to the secretion of progesterone, and that's why we see this blue line down here going up, okay? Now, you will expect it to go up, and yes, it causes the proliferation of the endometrial wall, okay? However, we see it going down again. Now, why is that? The corpus luteum needs something to keep it alive. Now, what made it in the first place was the LH surge, okay? And you had LH at the beginning. But because corpus luteum, again, it's secreting hormones, it's secreting progesterone, a lot of it, and also estrogen, these two, again, negatively feedback the anterior pituitary. and so they decrease the secretion of FSH and LH. Because of that, the corpus luteum starts dying, and it doesn't secrete as much progesterone, and so your progesterone levels go down. Now remember, we said progesterone is needed to like thicken the wall, the endometrial wall, so it's basically for implantation and pregnancy. But because it's going down, you start shedding your endometrial wall, and so the menstrual cycle begins again. Okay, so this was just an overview of what we'll basically be talking about. All right. And one thing I want to mention is that before day 14 and after day 14, we have two phases. Okay. So the phase before day 14, the ones from day 1 to 14, that's called the follicular phase or the proliferative phase. Here we'll be saying it as follicular phase because that's what relates to the ovarian cycle. Because proliferative phase relates to the endometrial wall, so it would be proliferating. Okay. Now, then day 14, we have ovulation. And from day 14 to day 28, we have the luteal phase, okay, or the secretory phase. So it's called luteal phase because you got the corpus luteum, okay, and secretory because mainly you're getting a lot of progesterone being secreted. All right. Okay. So before we go into the phases themselves and folliculogenesis, let's talk about the general structure of a follicle. Okay. So this is a follicle. It doesn't matter what stage it is. I just want you guys to focus on the structure. Okay. So in the middle here, we see the oocyte, which is the actual egg. Okay. This is what will be fertilized later on. Around that egg, we have a layer of protective protein called the zona pellucida. Okay. And then around that, we have the granulosa cells. Now, these are the main cells that secrete the hormones estrogen and progesterone, all right? So we have the granulosa cells, and now this is the layer that keeps on thickening with maturation. Above that, we have the thecal cells, okay? Now, I know it says here theca interna and externa, but that's not really necessary for this lecture. Just know that there's granulosa cells and then thecal cells outside that. Between the granulosa and thecal cells, you have a basement membrane, which is not shown on the figure here, but you do have a basement membrane between the granulosa cells and the thecal cells. Okay. Finally, you have an antrum here, which shows that this is a follicle that is really close to becoming the dominant follicle. It's maturing so much. And this antrum is filled with antral fluid. Okay, now this fluid is very good for nutrition, for hormones, and so on. Now, this is a histological image of the same thing. You have the oocytes, which is the egg. You have the zona pellucida around that, and then you have the granulosa cells and the thecal cells outside that. And remember, there's a basement membrane between the granulosa cells and the thecal cells. All right, and the antrum, of course. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the phases and the cycles again and again and again, okay? But each time we'll be focusing on a certain thing. But remember, all these things connect to each other, okay? So we start off with the ovarian phases from the follicular phase, days 1 to 13, okay? You can say day 1 to 14, doesn't matter, but that is just to make them easier and not overlapping. So we started off with FSH production stimulates recruitment and growth of the follicles. We've said that before. And then granulosa cells only respond to FSH and produce estrogen. Now this is important because when we go furthermore, we'll see that LH mainly acts on the thecal cells, the ones on the outside, and FSH mainly acts on the granulosa cells. All right. However, the granulosa cells do start responding to LH at a certain point, okay? But for now, they mainly respond to FSH in the follicular phase, okay? So the granulosa cells secrete the estrogen, and then this estrogen provides a feedback inhibition to the anterior pituitary, so it decreases the secretion of LH and FSH. FSH production slightly declines, and this explains the FSH peak we saw at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, day 1. Okay? Now, we said we need LH to also stimulate the granulosa cells. So how does that happen? Because the granulosa cells are being constantly stimulated by FSH, the amount of cyclic AMP in the granulosa cells, starts increasing. And this stimulates LH receptors to go to the surface of granulosa cells. And so now the granulose cell will be able to respond to both FSH and LH. Okay, so increased cyclic AMP upregulates LH receptors on the granulosa cells, and it allows both FSH and LH to stimulate them. Okay, now this last point here is saying that low gonadotropins, especially FSH, causes granulosa cell death and follicular atresia. Now, what do I mean by this? Because we said that feedback inhibition is decreasing the secretion of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, these follicles do need these gonadotropins to grow even more. However, because there isn't much FSH left, the cell with the follicle, sorry, with the most FSH receptors is the one that stays alive. And that's the one that we call the dominant follicle. Okay? The rest die. All right? So only the follicle with the highest amount of FSH receptors survives. So this is for the follicular phase. Are there any questions? Okay. All right. Now let's move on to day 14 ovulation, okay, or we call it the mid-cycle. So remember what we said here, we have the estrogen, but because it's so much, it switches to a positive feedback mechanism on the anterior pituitary, and this triggers the LH surge, and so you get the ovulation, okay? So the stimulation LH surge causing the release of the mature oocytes from the follicle. And then we are remained with corpus luteum. So the remaining parts of the follicle will be corpus luteum. So ovulation is pretty straightforward. It's very simple. Okay. Finally, the luteal phase, which is days 15 to 28. You can say 14 to 28, so it doesn't matter. Okay. So what happens here? Now we're talking about the corpus luteum. We said the secretion of hormones switches from being mainly estrogen to becoming mainly progesterone. So something I want to point here is that the cycle, the menstrual cycle, is predominantly run by estrogen in the first half, in the follicular phase. And then in the second half, in the luteal phase, it's run by progesterone. Okay? So the corpus luteum now secretes large amounts of estrogen and large amounts of progesterone and some estrogen. These two hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone, they provide a negative feedback to the anterior pituitary to decrease the production of FSH and LH, like we explained before. Okay, because of this, now there isn't much LH to keep the corpus luteum alive, and so the corpus luteum dies. Okay, now another point that we mentioned is that LH mainly acts on thecal cells. So what do the thecal cells do? Thecal cells have LH receptors that are activated to synthesize androstenedione. Now, if you guys know, androstenedione is an androgen. Okay, however, this androgen will get converted to estrogen as well. Now, how does that happen? This androstenedione diffuses from the thecal cell to the granulosa cell, if you guys remember the structure, okay? And then that diffuses through the basement membrane into the granulosa cell, and then it's converted to estrogen by the enzyme aromatase, okay? Now, does this only happen in the luteal phase? No, it happens throughout the entire cycle, okay? But this is the main way to get estrogen, okay, especially in the luteal phase, because if you guys noticed, we mainly secrete progesterone from the granulosa cells in the luteal phase, but we also do need to secrete estrogen. So where does that come from? It comes from the androstenedione that's secreted by the thecal cells. Okay, don't worry about this part. We will be talking about it again and again repeatedly. Okay, so do not worry. So again, androstenedione diffuses to the granulosa cells and it's converted to 17-beta estradiol by aromatase. Now, estradiol, estrogen, estrone, these are all the same thing, okay? But I'll be using estradiol and estrogen interchangeably. All right. So now, because LH production is declining, we said the corpus luteum dies, and you get less progesterone, and you get menstruation, because progesterone is what's needed to maintain the integrity of the endometrial wall. So if that doesn't work, then the wall will start shedding, and you get menstruation. So Well, this was actually supposed to be a question for you guys, but I already showed the answer. So the only case in which corpus luteum stays alive is in pregnancy by HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropin. Right, we said the corpus luteum needs LH to keep it alive. So LH, when LH goes down because of the negative feedback, you get the corpus luteum dying, right? However, there are cases in which corpus luteum stays alive, and that case is pregnancy. Okay, it doesn't stay alive because of LH though. It's because of human chorionic gonadotropin. All right. So this was it for the ovarian phases, and don't worry, we'll be repeating all these concepts again and again. Okay. Now let's talk about why we get the stimulation of FSH and LH in the first place, right? There must be something coming from higher up. So, and that is GnRH. Okay, so GnRH basically comes from the hypothalamus and it stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete LH and FSH. And now LH and FSH stimulate the ovaries, and then these ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone and many other hormones we'll talk about. Okay, now we see these negative feedback and positive feedback loops. Mainly, we get negative feedback by estrogen and progesterone on the pituitary, like we've seen. Okay, we've seen that happen in the follicular phase, and that's why FSH mainly goes down. And we've seen that happen in the luteal phase, which is why LH goes down, and then you get corpus luteum dying and all that. Okay. However, we also see negative feedback going to the hypothalamus. Now, how does that work? Because we have these two hormones, inhibin A and B. Okay, these act on GnRH. Now, something to note is that GnRH itself has to be secreted in a pulsatile manner in order to be able to stimulate the pituitary gland. So what do I mean by that? If GnRH is constantly being secreted, okay, so if it's just like in one line, okay, one concentration, that doesn't stimulate the pituitary, okay? It actually inhibits it. So GnRH has to go up and down, so that the LH and FSH can be secreted. So what inhibin does is that it acts on that pulsatile manner of release, okay? It doesn't make it pulsatile anymore, it makes it continuous. Okay, so that's for the negative feedback. Now the positive feedback. So when does that happen? If you guys noticed, it was in ovulation. Okay, ovulation is the only time when estrogen, mainly estrogen, provides positive feedback to the pituitary. And what does that trigger? The LH surge. All right, so this is another figure. Okay, you see here, LH from the pituitary is mainly acting on the thecal cells and mainly acting on the granulosa cells. All right. However, estrogen goes back and it inhibits the secretion of FSH, while during ovulation, it increases the secretion of LH for the surge. Now, progesterone goes back to the anterior pituitary and it inhibits the secretion of LH and FSH. All right. And finally, inhibins, they act on the pituitary and the hypothalamus to decrease FSH, LH, and also GnRH. Now, GnRH itself is regulated by things, of course. Okay. What is it regulated by? It's positively stimulated by leptin and kisspeptin. Now, kisspeptin is really important here. And then negatively inhibited by beta endorphins, dopamine, prolactin, IL-1, GABA. Okay, so all these many things. Now, these are not really important, but that's just for the sake of completion. All right. So this is the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, HPO. So GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is released from the hypothalamus in a pulsatile manner. This stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. Now, FSH mainly acts on the granulosa cells, while LH mainly acts on the thecal cells. These two hormones then stimulate the production of estrogen and progesterone, and each hormone predominates at certain parts of the cycle. Estrogen is the follicular phase, and progesterone is in the luteal phase. Finally, remember the concept of cyclic AMP. Okay, so FSH and LH bind to G protein coupled receptors and increase the levels of cyclic AMP, leading to increased steroidogenesis, which basically means the synthesis of the androgens and other hormones. Okay, now we said that because cyclic AMP increases, you get more LH receptors, and so you get more synthesis of estrogen and progesterone. Okay. Now, for the negative positive feedback mechanisms, the only positive feedback thing we have is in ovulation. Okay, in the mid-cycle phase, we have the high amounts of estrogen coming from the dominant follicle. This triggers the LH surge. Now, for negative feedback, we have in the follicular phase, it's mainly estrogen. Okay, so estrogen offers a negative feedback to the anterior pituitary to decrease FSH production. If you remember the peak, it goes up and down. And then in the luteal phase, so after, you have both estrogen and progesterone that cause the decreased production of FSH and LH by the anterior pituitary. And finally, these also negatively influence the pulsatile release of GnRH by the hypothalamus. Inhibin A and B decrease FSH and LH production by the anterior pituitary. Okay, so again, mainly we have negative feedback mechanisms when it comes to the ovarian cycle and the HPO axis. But the only positive thing we see is when we get the LH stage because of estrogen. Okay. And here I did a table for the positive and negative regulation of GnRH. The ones you have to focus on are kisspeptin and leptin. They positively influence the GnRH pulsatile secretion. Okay, so do you guys have any question about what I've explained so far? No? Okay. All right. Now we're done with the HPO axis, and now we'll go to the ovarian hormones. Okay. So, yeah. So in the ovarian hormones, we mainly have six hormones that are being secreted by the ovaries. We talked about estrogen and progesterone and androgens. Okay. Then we also have inhibin, and we have activin and follistatin, which is an activin binding protein. We'll talk about each one in details. So let's start with estrogen, because that's the one we like. Okay, so its synthesis is enzymatically coordinated between the thecal and granulosal cells. So remember that whole thing about androstenedione diffusing from the thecal cells into the granulosa cells and then being converted into estrogen? That's what I'm talking about, okay? And we will see, like, there's a whole figure about this whole conversion process. We will be going to. Now, 95% of the circulating estradiol comes from the ovaries, so this shows that ovaries secrete a very large amount of estrogen. But keep in mind, males also have estrogen, okay? And females also have testosterone. So it's not that males only have testosterone and they do not have estrogen. Well, vice versa for females. No, we have both. It's just that the concentrations are different, okay? Now, smaller amounts come from the conversion of estrone to estradiol. Now, this is not important, but estrone is a weak form of estrogen, okay? And then it gets converted into the strong form of estrogen, which is estradiol. Next is progesterone, our second favorite. Okay, so the LH surge switches follicular cell steroidogenesis to production of progesterone. Now keep in mind, follicular cells are the same as granulosa cells, the ones that are surrounding the oocytes. Okay, and like we said, mainly we have estrogen before ovulation, and then after ovulation we have progesterone. Okay. Now, why does this happen? Because we have an increased expression of CYP11A1 and 3-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which I'm sure you guys saw in the endocrine part of the block. Okay, and these two hormones stimulate the conversion of cholesterol into progesterone. Finally, progesterone then regulates aromatase. And remember, we said aromatase is needed to convert certain androgens like androstenedione into estrogen. Okay, so this is why we get decreased estrogen production. So if you guys noticed in the luteal phase, we had very high amounts of progesterone, but the estrogen wasn't that high because of this. Okay. Next, we have androgens. Now, we will be focusing a bit on androgens here because there's this whole two-cell model thing, okay? It seems scary, but it's fine. All right. So androgens come from the adrenal glands, the ovaries, and from peripheral conversion of androstenedione and DHEA to testosterone. Okay, that's just some general talk. Now, in the ovaries, where we're talking, LH stimulates thecal cells to make androstenedione. We've already mentioned that. Androstenedione then goes through the basement membrane to the granulosa cells, where it is converted to estradiol. And this is where we talk about the two-cell model of ovarian steroidogenesis. Okay? Finally, keep in mind that we have blood vessels around the ovaries and all these granulosa cells and thecal cells in which the androgens can go into. Okay? So it's not that the androgen is strictly within the follicle. No, it can like leak out. All right? So the two-cell model of ovarian steroidogenesis. Now, steroidogenesis, again, it means synthesis of androgens or estrogen, progesterone hormones, basically. Okay? So this is a very simplified diagram. We have LH stimulating mainly thecal cells and FSH acting on granulosa cells. Okay? Uh, Thecal cells convert cholesterol into androgens, and mainly here androstenedione, and then that diffuses across the basement membrane and goes into the granulosa cells, where aromatase will convert androgens into estrogen. Now let's take this a step further, and this is the complicated diagram. Please don't get scared. It's okay. Okay. Now, we have here the thecal cell, basement membrane in blue, and we have the granulosa cell. Okay, we'll start with the thecal cell. So thecal cell mainly responds to LH receptors, LH, sorry. So you have LH receptors, and so when these are stimulated, you get steroidogenesis. So the conversion of cholesterol into androstenedione. Okay, this is the only thing that happens in the thecal cell. So it's simple so far. Then androstenedione goes across the basement membrane into the granulosa cell, and then it is converted to estradiol by aromatase. Okay? Now see, FSH stimulates aromatase, and so you get a lot of estrogen. So this explains why in the follicular phase where you mainly have FSH, you get high amounts of estrogen. Okay? Now what happens when the LH surge hits? We get an increased expression of LH receptors, and so you get LH stimulating the granulosa cells too. Okay, now because of that, we get steroidogenesis in the granulosa cell. However, the steroidogenesis is not to produce androstenedione, but it is to produce progesterone. Now, how does that happen? Because we have these proteins or enzymes. We have the star protein, CYP11A1, and 3-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. We've mentioned them already. These three have an increased expression in the luteal phase, and so that's why you get cholesterol being converted to pregnenolone and then to progesterone. Okay, so because of this, you get the increased progesterone that you see in the luteal phase. All right. Now we said progesterone can inhibit aromatase, and so that's why you don't get that much conversion to estradiol in the luteal phase. So is this quite clear about the two-cell model? Okay, because I think that one was one of the complicated ones. Okay, I guess it's clear. So again, this is in word form. Okay, so basically we have the thecal cells. Okay, now in the thecal cells, LH from the pituitary acts on LH receptors. This stimulates the steroidogenesis and the production of androgens by the conversion of cholesterol into androstenedione. Then androstenedione crosses the basement membrane from the thecal cell into the granulosa cell, and then talk about the granulosa cell. So if you guys notice, we have two different things happening in the granulosa cell. Something mainly happens before ovulation and then after ovulation. So in the pre-ovulatory or follicular phase, you got FSH from the pituitary gland acting on the granulosa cell and stimulating aromatase. Now, aromatase is used to convert androstenedione to estradiol. Now, post-ovulation, you got that switch to progesterone synthesis. So LH stimulates steroidogenesis. And then this happens by increasing star protein and the other enzymes. And now this converts cholesterol to pregnenolone to progesterone. All right. Again, all these hormones can diffuse into nearby blood vessels. So again, something about androgen now. Now, let's say you have an excess conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone for any reason. Okay, let's say females, I don't know, under stress, increased secretion from the adrenal glands of testosterone, for example. So if there is an excess conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, this can lead to virilization. Virilization means that an increase in masculine features. So you get hirsutism, facial hair, acne, big muscles, okay? So if you guys notice, I'm hinting to a certain disease here, but we'll talk about that later. Now, let's talk about how we are protected from this. Does anyone have any idea how we're protected from this excess conversion? All right, so I'll help you guys out. So we have something called sex hormone binding globulin. Okay, so sorry, yeah. So sex hormone binding globulin is basically something that binds to testosterone and inhibits its conversion into dihydrotestosterone. Okay, now what stimulates sex hormone binding globulin? It's estrogen. So right, because females have a lot of estrogen, we stimulate the release of a lot of sex hormone binding globulin, so we get a lot of binding to testosterone. All right. Now, in some cases, some females have an increased secretion of androgens, okay? And this globulin cannot keep up with that. So this leads to PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. It's characterized by increased androgens and subsequently virilization. So these females will come to you complaining of increased facial hair, of acne, okay? Yeah, and that's about androgens. Finally, we have, not finally, next hormone, we have inhibin. Okay, we've already talked about it, but keep in mind, inhibin B and inhibin A also predominate two parts of the cycle. So inhibin B is mainly seen in the follicular phase because it's mainly related to FSH and the granulosa cells, while inhibin A is mainly produced by the corpus luteum. Okay, so you see that in the luteal phase. So again, it's produced by the granulosa cells of mature follicles. It's regulated by FSH, LH, growth factor hormones, not important. Inhibin B, this is important. It's a marker of granulosa cell function. It's FSH regulated and seen mainly in the follicular phase. While inhibin A is a marker of the corpus luteum, it's LH regulated and seen mainly in the luteal phase. Now we said it has a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. Now, last two hormones we have are activin and the activin binding protein, prolactin. So activin from the name, it activates the granulosa cells and promotes the proliferation and so on. Okay, so it's produced by granulosa cells. It has a paracrine action, meaning that so it's produced by the granulosa cells and it acts on the granulosa cells as well. Okay, and it acts locally. So the activin promotes granulosa cell proliferation by upregulating FSH receptors. So because FSH receptors are upregulated, you get more stimulation of granulosa cells to proliferate. It also increases the hormone synthesis, so it stimulates steroidogenesis in both fecal and granulosa cells. And finally, it binds to inhibin. So when activin binds to inhibin, it inhibits the function of inhibin. Okay, and so inhibin cannot decrease the pituitary function. All right, so activin binds to inhibin and antagonizes its action, which removes the feedback inhibition of pituitary FSH secretion, leading to more FSH production. Follistatin, finally, it's the activin binding protein. It's secreted by the granulosa cells as well, and it neutralizes the effect of activin on steroid production. So because from the name it's an activin binding protein, that means it inhibits activin from acting on the granulosa cells. So activin inhibits inhibin, and follistatin inhibits activin. Okay. So this is all about the ovarian hormones. Now, let's move on to folliculogenesis. So what we've talked about so far is basically the hormones and the cycles and all that. But what happens to the follicles themselves? How do we go from a primordial follicle to the grafting follicle we see in the end, and then to ovulation? So we have different stages of follicular development. First, we start with the primordial follicle, which is that one. Now, the primary oocyte is put into the primordial follicle. Now, this is lined by just one layer of squamous cells, okay? And this is actually present in a female since before she was born, like while she's in gestation, okay? And it stays that way, stays dormant until puberty, okay? Now, after that, we got the primary follicle and the secondary follicle. Now, these two are pre-antral follicles. Pre-antral means that they stop having they right before they start developing the antrum. Okay, primary follicle. Here's the structure. Okay, and the secondary follicle. Now, how are they different? Primary follicle is different from the primordial follicle because its layer of simple squamous cells is now simple cuboidal. So the cells, like instead of being flat, they just flatten up. Okay. And then the secondary follicle is basically when these granulosa cells start proliferating in number and forming layers, and you start getting the thecal cells. Okay, we'll talk about each one in details. Then we have the tertiary follicle, which is the antral follicle. This is when we start to see the antrum. Okay, so you can see here. And then we have the graphene follicle, which is the pre-ovulatory and dominant follicle. Okay, this is the one that is destined to go for ovulation. Okay, you see here the antrum is really big. Okay, and you have the cumulus cells here, corona radiata, okay, and then you have thecal cells around and all that. And then finally, when ovulation happens, you get the corpus luteum, and then this dies off. Okay, so let's talk about each one. But before we go into that, we need to know that so when you have the menstrual cycle, it's not that your eggs or your follicles, sorry, go from primordial to pre-ovulatory in those 14 days, okay, in the follicular phase. That's not what happens. Okay. You get maturation, but that happens on its own and at its own pace. Okay. It's not related to the menstrual cycle. It happens in these stages, primordial, primary, and secondary. So in the pre-antral stages. Okay, so you see here pre-antral phase. Now this is not dependent on FSH and LH. So it's known as gonadotropin independent. Okay. However, once you start seeing the antrum, this means that this follicle is involved in this month's ovarian cycle or menstrual cycle. And then this is what goes into ovulation, okay, in those 14 days, the maturation we see in 14 days, okay? And then, now this one is the one that's dependent on FSH and LH, and so it is gonadotropin dependent, okay? So this concept is really important because a lot of people think that, okay, when you start the menstrual cycle, and when FSH starts, like being secreted, you start from the primordial follicle, and then you go to the pre-ovulatory in 14 days. That is not the case, okay? You go from tertiary to pre-ovulatory or Graafian in 14 days, okay? Now, let's start with the primordial follicle. We said this one is present since birth, okay? Now, um, when we are in our mother's womb, like females, we have like about 7 million of these primordial follicles. However, when we're born, they obviously died in number, and so we have about 400,000 to 800,000 left. And then when we reach puberty, they're even less. They reach about 300,000. Now, do all these 300,000 follicles go into maturation? No. We only take about 30,000 of them. And in the end, we only ovulate about 500. Okay. So even though we're born with so much, we don't end up ovulating all. Okay. So when the female baby is in mother's womb, okay, during gestation, primary oocytes are put into the primordial follicles in the ovaries. Now, these primary oocytes are arrested in prophase 1. We'll talk about the oocyte itself and the meiosis that goes on in it later on. Okay. There are about 7 million of these primordial follicles in gestation. A layer of simple squamous epithelium, which is basically follicular or granulosa cells, like mainly pre-granulosa cells, okay? This lies around the oocytes with gap junctions in between the cells. This is for communication. Now, this layer then develops into the granulosa cells that provide nutrients to support oocyte maturation. So, of course, as the follicle is growing, the oocyte itself also grows. And so you need nutrients for it, right? Now, the granulosa cells, that's what helps the maturation. Now, at birth, like we said, the number of follicles goes down to 400,000 up to 800,000. Note that these follicles are not responsive to FSH, they don't grow, and they don't produce steroids. They're dormant, okay? So they're just sitting there, okay? Just waiting to go into maturation. They don't do anything, all right? At puberty, about 300,000 primordial follicles remain. Of these, around 30,000 will start maturing to some degree. Now, like we said, the rate of maturation is independent of gonadotropins. So it's not that when I get FSH, oh, this primordial follicle will start becoming a primary follicle. No. Okay? Obviously, it is stimulated, but it's stimulated by other things. Okay, other paracrine factors, but not FSH and I. Now, this maturation, however, is restrained by anti-Mullerian hormone. Okay, so we will see later on that in order for the follicles to mature, something has to inhibit anti-Mullerian hormone. Finally, a woman will only ovulate approximately 500 follicles from menarche from the first time she gets her period to menopause. The remaining ones at menopause will be about 1,000 and they all die off. So a woman doesn't get ovulation. So this is just the structure. So we have primordial. You see they're very thin. It's a very thin layer around the egg. Okay. But then the primary follicle, you see now these squamous cells become cuboidal. And now secondary, you have many layers. Okay. So now we're talking about the pre-antral follicles, which are the primary and secondary. So at puberty, primordial follicles start growing into primary and secondary follicles. The simple squamous layer of cells changes to a simple cuboidal layer forming the primary follicle. And then when these cuboidal cells become multiple layers, you get the secondary follicle. This growth is induced by paracrine factors, like I said, and not FSH or LH. Finally, the paracrine factors also induce the stromal cells outside the basement membrane to form the thecal cell. So remember, yes, okay, we've seen in a picture at the beginning of the lecture that we had a secondary follicle with a layer of cells, of thecal cells around it. Okay, keep in mind that when we talk about these follicles, it's not that it goes directly from one stage to the other. Okay, it's not like it switches immediately. There is like a little gray area, okay, between each stage. So between primary and secondary, follicle starts looking different. Secondary and tertiary start getting differences as well. Okay, we just name like certain markers. Okay, so now we do get the secondary follicle starting with the multiple layers. And then as these multiple layers are showing, you start getting the basement membrane and then you get the thecal cells. Okay? But it's still considered a secondary follicle or a mature pre-entry follicle. Okay? Now, the oocyte now also secretes glycoproteins to form the zona pellucida. So when it was primordial and when it was primary, it did not have the zona pellucida. It only had granulosa cells. When it reaches secondary, it forms the thecal cells and the zona pellucida right around the oocyte. Finally, these granulosa cells and the oocyte, they need to communicate, okay? So they project things through the zona pellucida, and this allows for communication through gap junctions. So the granulosa cells and oocyte extend projections through the zona pellucida to maintain gap junctions. Now remember, while the granulosa cells express FSH receptors, they are unresponsive to FSH because they still haven't developed into an antral follicle. Now, yes, we said that up till now they are gonadotropin independent, but that doesn't mean they don't have the receptors. Okay, they have them, but they're just not responding to them. Now keep in mind that this whole process of going from a primordial to a pre-antral follicle takes 3 months. So obviously it doesn't take 14 days, it takes 3 months. And it does not follow the menstrual cycle. Now, do you guys need to remember the number of follicles that we saw, like the 7 million to 300,000, 30,000? No. Okay. It's just to show you like how we're born with so many follicles, but then in the end we only ovulate like 500 in our lifetime. Okay. Do you need to know the number of months here? Okay. Because we'll see other like numbers as well. No. Okay. So to go from primordial to preantral, so secondary, you need 3 months. Okay. And is not under the influence of FSH and LH. Now, meanwhile, these maturing follicles move from the cortex towards the medulla. So they move from the inside of the ovary towards the outside. Of course, this has to happen because if this egg is going to be released, okay, it has to be close to the wall of the ovary to give it a chance to be released outside, okay, and then to be caught by the fimbria. Okay, so let's talk about the antral follicles now. So that's tertiary. We started with preantral, and then these develop into early antral follicles, so early tertiary follicles in 25 days. So we started with 3 months from primordial to preantral, and then you have another 25 days to go from preantral to early antral. Then you need 45 more days to go from small antral follicles to large and recruitable antral follicles. It's still tertiary, okay? All these antral follicles are tertiary. It's either early or late tertiary. So you need 3 months and then 25 days and then 45 days. So 3 more months because that's 70 days. So you need a total of 6 months to go from primordial follicle up to large recruitable antral follicle. So up to tertiary. Now these large antral follicles are the ones that go into the menstrual cycle. These are the ones that get stimulated by FSH and LH, and these are the ones that go into ovulation. Okay? So these recruitable antral follicles are the ones that enter the monthly menstrual and ovarian cycle, and they start getting stimulated by FSH and LH. They're highly dependent on FSH for their growth and viability. So when we talk about antral follicles, we have the antrum, right? You guys have seen it. So it separates the granulosa cells into two populations. One that's close to the oocytes, and we call that the cumulus uh, cells or corona radiata. It has many names. And then we have the granulosa cells close to the basement membrane. These are called the mural granulosa cells. Mural means wall, okay? So mural granulosa cells, the ones towards the basement membrane, are found there and are separated from the Keiko cells. This layer is highly steroidogenic and also forms the corpus luteum after ovulation. Of course, because that's the one that's away from the oocytes, so it won't go with the oocytes at ovulation. And this is the layer that mainly secretes the hormones. The cumulus cells, however, are the ones that are around the oocytes. They can also be called cumulus oophorus or corona radiata. And the inner layer of these cumulus cells, the one right beside the oocytes, it has gap junctions between the oocytes and that inner layer to maintain communication of something, okay? And we will talk about that. Like, why do we need these gap junctions? Cumulus cells are released with the oocyte at ovulation, of course. And now, because you have cells surrounding the oocyte, this allows the fimbria to easily capture the oocyte and then be taken into the fallopian tubes. So again, here I just want to show you guys the two populations of the granulosa cells. We have the mural one, okay? So the mural granulosa cells, so this is the one that's highly steroidogenic, and um, yeah, it forms the corpus luteum after ovulation. And then we have the one right beside the oocytes, which is the corona radiata. This is the one that goes out with it at ovulation. Now, here's something I want you guys to understand. It's that in order to go from primordial follicle to large antral follicles, so to tertiary, it's not that all these follicles started maturing at the same time. So when you hit puberty, no, they started different times. Some started the day you hit puberty. some started 3 months later, some started 5 years later. Okay, so what does this say? All stages of follicular development are present at the same time. It's not that you only have for example, the tertiary follicles now. No, you can even have primordial follicles. Okay, so before we move on to the dominant follicle, were the other follicles clear? The primordial, primary, secondary, preantral, antral. Okay. All right, let's move on to the dominant follicle. Now, we said that we go from tertiary to graphene. Okay, so graphene is also called the preovulatory or the dominant. This is the one that goes for maturation, for ovulation. Sorry. Okay, so at menses, day one, 15 large antral follicles, which are the tertiary follicles, are recruited, and they are now gonadotropin dependent. So 15 to 20 of these tertiary follicles that we got in the end, okay, these go for a round of maturation, okay, according to the menstrual cycle. Now, a race occurs. Why? Because we have FSH stimulating these follicles, right? But these follicles are subsequently producing a lot of estrogen. And we said this estrogen inhibits the release of FSH, okay? So FSH goes down. Now, the one with the most FSH receptor is the one that will survive, okay? Obviously, because it's the one stimulated the most. However, the others will undergo attrition. So that's why you're left with one dominant follicle, okay? Now, this dominant follicle releases the most amount of estrogen and becomes a large pre-ovulatory follicle, which is the graphene follicle, by mid-cycle. So by day 14, okay? Now, this follicle is obviously continuously stimulated by gonadotropins, which are FSH and LH, to produce steroids. And again, the thecal cells express LH receptors and produce androgens, while the mural granulosa cells have the FSH receptors, and this helps it stimulates aromatase to convert androgens into estrogen. So mainly you convert androstenedione into estrone and testosterone into estradiol. Now this point's not important, it's just telling you that when you get FSH acting on mural granulosa cells, you stimulate aromatase to convert androgens into estrogen. Now, also FSH drives the production of estradiol and inhibin in the follicular phase. Remember, we're in the follicular phase now. So we're talking about the graphene follicle, that's follicular phase. It also induces the expression of LH receptors in the mural granulosa cells. Remember, we said the increased FSH stimulation increases cyclic AMP inside the cell, and so the LH receptor expression increases. So I just wanted to talk about something here. When we said the follicle starts moving towards the wall, right? When it reaches the graphene stage, it forms this bump on the ovary wall, and you can actually see it with your naked eye. So this bump is called the stigma, okay? And then from the stigma, this is where you get the ovulation habit, okay? So the ovum or the egg literally goes out of the ovary. Okay, so it just flies out in the wild. Okay. So now we talked about the dominant follicle before ovulation, right before. Now what happens to it at ovulation? Obviously you're left with the corpus luteum, but how do the changes happen? So before ovulation, the dominant follicle presses against the ovary wall, forming a stigma. Then, when the LH surge hits, it induces inflammatory cytokines and hydrolytic enzymes to break down the wall at the stigma. So, what does this mean? You have the stigma, okay? Now, the follicle is pushing against the ovary wall, but it needs something to break through, okay? It needs to break down that ovary wall. So, how does it do that? By releasing hydrolytic enzymes and inflammatory cytokines. Now, the cumulus oocyte complex is now released and floats freely in the antral cavity. Okay. Now, obviously, we need to allow the easy capture of this oocyte, okay, and the complex basically with the cumulus cells. So the cumulus cells have to get a lot of water, okay, in order to become fluffy. Okay, so Now, to allow the easy capture of this complex by the oviducts, LH induces the release of TGF beta, which is transforming growth factor, and GDF9, not important, okay? But the point is, when these cytokines are released, you get the release of hyaluronic acid from the cumulus cells. And now hyaluronic acid, we know, is attractive to like water is attracted to hyaluronics, okay? And so this complex starts absorbing water and it enlarges. So this gives it a better chance to be captured by the familia. Also, another thing is that when ovulation occurs, basal lamina of the mural granulosa cells is degraded, allowing blood and thecal cells to push into the granulosa cells. So what do we mean by that? We said we got the follicle opening up, okay, and the egg goes out. Now the remaining part, okay, has the basement membrane. Okay, so you have granulosa cell, basement membrane, and thecal cell. This basement membrane is broken down, and then blood goes in, and the thecal cells that were outside also go in into the antral cavity, and they mix with the granulosa cells. Now remember that ovulation is a very it's a relatively harsh process, okay? It's very aggressive. So because of that, you get like this kind of bleeding into the follicle, okay? However, we do need that. That's to supply the cumulus, the corpus luteum, okay? So to further increase the blood supply to the corpus luteum, the blood that came from the opening of the basal membrane isn't enough. You need to synthesize more blood vessels. So the granulosa cells secrete angiogenic factors like VEGF and all these things. Not important, okay? But it just secretes angiogenic factors to increase the blood supply, okay? So this is a picture showing the ovulation, moment of ovulation. So this is the wall of the ovary, okay? This is the follicle, the dominant one, and this is the ovum that was released with the cumulus cells around it, okay? Now, up here, we see the blood vessels and the thecal cells are going into the granulosa cells because the basement membrane is now broken. Okay, so now we're basically done with folliculogenesis. We're done with talking about the follicles themselves. Has this part been clear? Okay, great. But now, LH surge obviously not only triggers ovulation, it also, of course, does other things. It's a hormone, right? So what else happens in LH surge? First, we get that steroidogenic activity of the mural granulosa cells is altered. Remember, we have a switch from estrogen production to progesterone. Okay. Now, keep in mind when I say switch, I don't mean that you completely inhibit estrogen and you start only secreting progesterone and vice versa. No, you do have estrogen, a lot of estrogen and a little bit of progesterone in the follicular phase. And then in the luteal phase, you have a lot of progesterone and you still have some estrogen. Okay. Another thing the LH surge does, other than this switch, is that it allows the oocyte itself to complete meiosis one. Okay, so we know meiosis two, like there's one and two. So we'll talk about the oocyte itself later on. Okay, now let's see how the steroidogenic activity is altered. First, aromatase expression is inhibited, leading to decreased estrogen production. Okay, now this stops the positive feedback on LH secretion because if you remember, what drove the LH surge to happen in the first place? It was estrogen. Okay, so now you're decreasing the production of estrogen, so you decrease LH secretion. Also, we need an increased expression of LDL and HDL receptors. Now, if you guys notice, these are like for fat, okay? Why do we need that? We need these lipoproteins for steroid synthesis because now we are going to be synthesizing a lot of progesterone and forming the corpus luteum itself. Finally, there is an increased expression of star protein, CYP11A1, and 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase that allows the granulosa cells to secrete more progesterone. And we saw this in the two-cell model, okay? Last thing we mentioned is that the LH surge allows the oocyte to complete meiosis one. So we've talked about the follicle itself. Now let's talk about the oocyte itself. So let's talk about the oocyte maturation. Now this figure. Here we said that the primary oocytes are arrested as prophase 1. Okay, so they still haven't even started meiosis. Okay, why does that happen? First, this is the oocyte, okay, and then the zona pellucida, and these cells we'll say what they are later. Okay, now we have G protein coupled receptor here. It's stimulated a lot by hormones, like it can be stimulated by FSH, also other paracrine factors. Not important what stimulates. What's important is that because this G protein coupled receptor is stimulated, you get increased amounts of cyclic AMP. This is different than the cyclic AMP we talked about for increasing LH receptors. Okay, this is something else. That one was for the granulocytes. This is the oocyte, this is the egg itself, okay? So you get an increased expression of cyclic AMP, and we know cyclic AMP activates PKA, protein kinase A, and protein kinase A acts to phosphorylate. So of course it's going to be phosphorylating something. What is that? In order for cells to undergo meiosis, you need two things to bind to each other. What are they? You need cyclin and cyclin-dependent kinases. Okay? When these bind together, they form something called an MPF, which is mitotic promotion factor. Now, if you have protein kinase A, pKa phosphorylates these cyclins and cyclin-dependent kinases. So can they bind? No. And because of that, you don't get the formation of the MPF, and you cannot go through meiosis. Now, usually in cells, we have phosphodiesterase that inhibits cyclic AMP, correct? Now, why doesn't that work in the oocyte in this case? Because of cyclic GMP. Where does the cyclic GMP come from? It comes from the granulosa cells, okay? So remember the gap junctions we talked about? We said that the granulosa cells and the oocytes are connected to each other through projections that have gap junctions. And I said it's needed for communication. For communication of what? This cyclic GMP. This cyclic GMP inhibits phosphodiesterase, and so phosphodiesterase cannot break down cyclic AMP. So you get a lot of cyclic AMP, you get a lot of pKa, and you get a lot of phosphorylation of the cyclins and cyclin-dependent kinases. And so you cannot go through meiosis. All right? Now, cyclins and cyclin-dependent kinases are needed to promote meiosis. They bind together as a cyclin B CDK1 complex. No need to remember B and 1. All right? They're known as mitotic promotion factor. However, the increased amounts of cyclic AMP in the oocytes activates pKa. Then pKa phosphorylates cyclin B and CDK, preventing their binding to each other. This results in meiotic arrest of the oocytes in prophase 1. Now we said phosphodiesterase usually inhibits cyclic AMP. So why isn't this happening? Because of cyclic GMP. So cyclic GMP comes from the granulosa cells, and it passes through the gap junctions into the oocytes. Cyclic GMP then inhibits phosphodiesterase, and it allows the accumulation of cyclic AMP. Okay, so this is how the oocyte, the primary oocyte, is arrested as prophase 1. Now we said the LH surge helps it continue this meiosis, right? How does that happen? Basically, LH surge closes the gap junctions between the granulosa cells and the oocyte. So then, can cyclic GMP pass through and inhibit phosphodiesterase? No. So now phosphodiesterase can work. And if phosphodiesterase works, it breaks down cyclic AMP, it decreases the activity of pKa, and so you don't get phosphorylation of the cyclin and cyclin-dependent kinases, so they can bind now, and then meiosis can go on. So LH closes the gap junctions between the cumulus cells. This decreases cyclic GMP in the oocytes. Now phosphodiesterase can inhibit cyclic AMP and thus decrease pKa activity. Now the mitotic promotion factor can drive nuclear division, the completion of meiosis 1, and the release of the first polar body. Now, this polar body thing, like, females have two X's, okay? So one of them gets removed because you shouldn't have an extra X in the egg. Now, does the oocyte go through meiosis too? This is a question for you guys. So do you think that the oocyte continues meiosis too as well now? So with the LH surge, do you get the oocyte going through the entire meiotic process? Okay, I'll help you guys out. So the answer is a no. Okay, you don't get that happening. Why? It gets arrested again. Okay, so the secondary oocyte is arrested again at metaphase 2. Okay, why does that happen? Does that happen because of the cyclic AMP and the cyclic GMP thing again? No, it's not because of that. It's because of something else called MAP kinase. Okay, and this MAP kinase inhibits the cell from undergoing, like continuing meiosis. So this happens by MAP kinase and not cyclic GMP. Now, when does the oocyte finish meiosis? So we said it doesn't finish meiosis now with the LH surge. Now, when do you guys think the oocyte finishes meiosis? Okay, I'll help you guys out again. It finishes meiosis at fertilization. Okay, so yes, correct, if it gets fertilized. All right, so when you get fertilization, how does MAP kinase stop working? You get a rush of calcium inside the oocytes, and so this calcium inhibits MAP kinase, and so the cell can now undergo meiosis two. Now we're left with the corpus luteum, okay? The corpus luteum, like we said, is the remnant of the follicle that has been ovulated, and this corpus luteum basically secretes a lot of progesterone. The only case in which it stays alive is pregnancy, okay? Now, before it becomes called corpus luteum, because of the very um, like aggressive process of ovulation, this corpus luteum fills up with blood because of the bleeding that happens. And then it's called corpus hemorrhagicum. Now, in the mature corpus luteum, the granulosa cells enlarge and become filled with lipid, which replaces the antral cavity. Remember, we talked about the LDL and HDL receptors. Okay. Now, along with the lipids, you got thecal cells, blood vessels, mast cells, macrophages, leukocytes, okay, blah, 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 all these things. These infiltrates the granulosa layer, and this is to increase the strength and the integrity of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum steadily increases progesterone release starting from ovulation till the mid-luteal phase till day 22. Now, we said there's the switch from estrogen to progesterone, but it doesn't continue up till day 28. It continues up to day 22. Why? Because LH goes down, remember? Because of the negative feedback. So this progesterone that we're getting, it causes the thickening and modification of the uterine wall into an adhesive and supportive structure for implantation. Now, the granulosa lutein cells, and we call them lutein cells now because they're in the corpus luteum, they also secrete inhibin A instead of inhibin B. So remember, we said we have the switch from inhibin B to A, and inhibin A suppresses FSH and LH secretion. Because the LH concentration is declining, the corpus luteum starts regressing and progesterone goes down, and then you get menstruation. So we've repeated this concept multiple times. Finally, because corpus luteum starts dying, it ends up in a scar-like body called corpus albicans. So it's called albicans because it turns white, okay? And this is the scar-like body representing the remnants of the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is called, it's luteum because it's yellow color. So something about the corpus luteum itself is that its lifetime is 14 days. It is strictly 14 days. You have no variation on that. All women have it as 14 days. Okay. So why is it that we like women have different menstrual cycles? Like some women have 28, some 35, some 31. Why does that happen? Because of the follicular phase. Okay. It's not the luteal phase. All right. Luteal phase is the same for everyone. So the corpus luteum remains alive for strictly 14 days. This is the case for all women. The variation we see in menstrual cycles happens in the follicular phase, not the luteal phase. So here's a question for you guys. If a woman's menstrual cycle is 31 days long, on which day did she ovulate? So can you guys try to figure this out? Because let's say a couple is trying to get pregnant, okay? They will want to predict when the woman would ovulate, correct? So how can they do that? 17th. Good job. Good job. Okay. So yes, it's day 17. How did we calculate that? We did 31 minus 14. So you start from day 31, okay, the end of your menstrual cycle, and you go back 14 days because that's strict, right? So you go back and you end up at day 17. Okay. So this is when this woman ovulated. Now, again, the only case in which the corpus luteum stays alive is if it is saved by HCG in pregnancy. All right. So this is basically everything about the ovarian cycle. However, we're not done. Okay. We will talk about two clinical things. Okay. Very soon. All right. But before that, do you guys have any questions about anything we've uh, explained? I guess it's clear. All right. So we have two clinical things that we need to talk about. Which first, it's the luteal phase deficiency. So from the word, from the name, sorry, this means that there's something wrong with the corpus luteum. Now, why can that happen? Let's say a woman had her follicular phase now, she's in the follicular phase, but it became very short for any reason, okay? Or there was a factor that stressed her follicular phase, and so the follicle didn't end up maturing well, became immature, okay? So at ovulation, will the corpus luteum be strong enough? No, it will be very weak, won't be viable. And because of that, you won't get as much progesterone secreted from the corpus luteum. If you don't get much progesterone, what happens to the endometrial wall? It doesn't thicken enough. And so what can happen? Pregnancy may not occur. And so you get infertile. Okay? So the corpus luteum must be large and viable to produce a large amount of progesterone that can support implantation and pregnancy. If anything disturbs the follicular phase by affecting the HPO axis, the graphene follicle becomes defective, so the dominant follicle in the end. So this leads to a deficient corpus luteum, decreased progesterone, and infertility. Now, what are some disturbing factors? They can be heavy exercise, starvation, so people with anorexia, okay? High prolactin, because remember we said prolactin inhibits GnRH, okay? And abnormal thyroid function. Now, what does this show? This says that the bigger the size, the more the hormone, because the bigger the size of the corpus luteum, the more progesterone it will produce. Okay? Yeah, she'll be infertile. Yes, correct. Okay, because the progesterone doesn't go up as much, so her wall isn't thick enough. So because of that, implantation is going to be really hard. Okay? Now, let's go to the final thing, which is the Mittelschmerz, or middle pain, like like to remember it. So what is this? This is basically what happens at ovulation. Some women may experience a certain pain, okay, in the lower abdominal region, and this can happen because of the ovulation. Remember, we said it's a very aggressive process, Okay. So like basically your ovary, part of it's like literally rupturing. Okay. It bursts open. So that must be painful, right? But how does that happen? Because of that aggressive way, we said the inflammatory cytokines are released. You also get the fimbria trying to capture the ovum. So this contraction of the fimbria, all this may irritate the peritoneum. Okay, you guys have done GIT, you know what the peritoneum is. Okay, it's basically like the covering of the abdominal organs. All right, so all this can irritate the peritoneum, and this can cause pain. Okay, now sometimes this can be like mixed with appendicitis, but usually women would know that okay, I'm ovulating now, so they would feel the pain. Not everyone, but some women may feel that pain. Okay, so due to the inflammatory reaction induced by the LH surge and prostaglandins in ovulation, some pain may be experienced in the lower abdomen. Now, prostaglandins, remember, can be inflammatory. It is a transient mid-cycle pain. Pain can be explained by peritoneal irritation, follicular swelling or rupture, and the fallopian tube contraction. It can mimic appendicitis. Okay, now this is for the two clinical things you guys are required to know. And finally, we'll do practice questions. It's just three, okay? Bear with me. All right. So first question. Which pair of hormones is directly responsible for ovulation? So which of these two hormones are directly responsible for ovulation? C. Correct. Okay. So why is it C? Because it's estrogen and LH. Now, we said that because of the dominant follicle, you get so much estrogen, and then you get to switch from negative feedback to positive feedback. And that positive feedback stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce LH, and you get the LH surge. Okay, next question. In the menstrual cycle, as menstruation or bleeding ends, estrogen levels in the blood rise rapidly. Which of the following is the source of the estrogen? D. Are you sure? Keep in mind the timeline, okay? So you're not sure. Okay. So here we're talking about when menstruation ends, not at the end of the menstrual cycle. There's a difference. Okay. Any other guesses? A? All right. So the answer is actually C. Okay. Why? So we said that the follicles, when they develop, they produce a lot of estrogen, right? And this is the timeline we're talking about. We're talking when menstruation or bleeding ends. So a woman usually bleeds from day one to around day seven, right? So it's at the beginning in the follicular phase. It's not at the end of the menstrual cycle at day 28. So the corpuscle team isn't even there, okay? It's the follicle, all right? There's something about the high amounts of estrogen, okay? Did you understand this one? You got mixed up. That's okay. All right, great. Okay, finally, last question. Which hormone is responsible for developing follicles? One's very easy, very straightforward. B, yes. It's FSH, okay? From the name FSH, follicle stimulating. Okay, and yeah, and I'm done. Thank you for listening. Uh, Here's my contact information. If you guys have any questions, you can WhatsApp me or email me. And please do scan this QR code. We would love to hear your feedback about our sessions. You're welcome. You're welcome. So if you guys don't have any questions, please don't leave yet. Okay, we do have another session. about the menstrual cycle, but it's not with me, it's with my friend, okay? So you're welcome. You're welcome.